the U.S. Treasury at no interest to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing and loans it back to the Americans through the banks and charges interest on our currency. The Federal Reserve also buys government debt with money printed on printing presses and charges U.S. taxpayers interest on that money. Who actually owns the Federal Reserve Corporation? Who owns the central banks, the Federal Reserve banks? The ownership of the central banks is as follows: the Rothschild Bank of London, Warburg Bank of Hamburg, Rothschild Bank of Berlin, Lehman Brothers of New York, Lazard Brothers of Paris, Kuhn Loeb Bank of New York, Israel Moses Seif Banks of Italy, Goldman and Sachs of New York, Warburg Bank of Amsterdam, and Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. These banks are connected to the London banking house, which ultimately controls the Federal Reserve Corporation. In fact, to show that what I said is not imagination, not make-believe, the Rothschilds on their own website state that they've been the international force in international banking. The Rothschilds they have a major interest in OPEC and the oil industry. They own and control the gold markets, lock, stock, and barrel. Let's talk about debt, beginning with deficit, something that you have a need to know. If the government runs a deficit, the Federal Reserve prints dollars through the U.S. Treasury, buys the debt, and the dollars are circulated into the economy. In 1992, taxpayers paid the Federal Reserve banking system $286 billion in interest on debt the Federal Reserve purchased by printing money virtually cost-free. Doesn't that make you happy? 40% of our personal federal income tax goes to pay this interest. The Federal Reserve's books are not open to the public. Congress has yet to audit the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks, acting together, are a private credit monopoly. No body of men is more entrenched in power than the arrogant credit monopoly controlling the Federal Reserve Corporation and the Federal Reserve banks. Our people's money, to the tune of $1,200 billion in gold, was shipped abroad recently to redeem Federal Reserve notes and to pay other debts. You see, my friends, they won't redeem your Federal Reserve notes, but they'll redeem the Federal Reserve notes, our money, that's in the hands of foreigners, and give them the gold, not you. That's how much they love us. The greater part of our monetary stock has been shipped abroad to finance our competitors all around the world, their militaries, our enemies' militaries, technology, computer systems, everything, their infrastructures of their countries. Why should the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks be permitted to finance our competitors? And why aren't the American people informed about such expenditures? I believe that we have a right to know. If the media is truly unbiased, independent and thorough, why haven't they discussed all these issues with the public? Currently, half the states have at least a grassroots effort to abolish the Federal Reserve System, but they get no media exposure. Do you know why? Because the Federal Reserve banks own major stock in the major media, and if the major media disagrees with them, then the bankers threaten to call in the loans arbitrarily. Rockefeller also controls the Council on Foreign Relations, whose sole purpose is to stimulate interest in foreign affairs and a new world order. Most major newscasters belong to the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR controls many major newspapers and magazines around the United States and around the world. We American people are just as much slaves on a personal level as our government is to the international bankers. We keep on using the very tools that they put before our noses to enslave us. Credit cards. Credit cards imprison us. You see, we're no longer willing to save up to buy something. We have to have it right now. After all, we're Americans, and we're God's people, so God will supply, so let's go do it on credit. This does not make sense, my friends. The government has made it very easy to have what we want when we want it. It's called credit. And it seems very strange that in a land with so much wealth, 2% of the population owns their own homes. 60% have 3 credit cards used to the max, and 1% own their automobiles with no debt. I at least fit into that category with an old beat-up Ford. Let's talk about money reform. Dr. Edwin J. Vieira, attorney at law, specializing in constitutional law. He's the director for the National Alliance for Constitutional Money, gave an address in Denver, Colorado, and he spoke to the National Coalition to Reform Money and Taxes. And he clarified that there is no necessary connection between tax reform and money reform. There might be all kinds of desirable political and policy connections, but no necessary connection. He talked about good tax, good money, bad money. There's no necessary connection. In other words, you can have a good money system, such as constitutional money, gold and silver, which is commodity money, and a bad tax system, or vice versa. You can have constitutional money and the federal income tax run essentially as a gross receipts tax. No necessary connection. So fixing a problem in one area won't necessarily fix a problem in the other area. You can have tax reform all you want, but if the money system is not corrected, we will still be enslaved to the satanic Illuminati world bankers. And Dr. Vieira asks, what is the major problem with money reform? It is ignorance, he says. Apathy and fear come into play because people are apathetic. They don't care to do anything. They think Jesus will come. They're going to get raptured first. I'm not going to debate the rapture here, but they just think they're going to get out of it. Let all other Christians around the world go through persecution, but by God, we're Americans. We ain't going through it. Now, when I start getting angry, I start talking Texan. So you just have to excuse that. I spent about 7 years in the wonderful nation of Texas and really enjoyed it. I just felt like the lid came off my horizon because the sky was so big, and I really liked it. But I got off my notes here. I'm rambling. See, when I start rambling, I just start talking about all kinds of wonderful things. Let's, for example, if you were to travel around the country and check into a hotel, here's an example of the ignorance that I am talking about. You go to the desk and you check in, and the clerk says, how are you going to pay for this? And if you said, well, do you accept Federal Reserve notes? She'll say, no, we accept money. Or Visa, MasterCard, American Express. And if you pull out a dollar bill and point to where it says Federal Reserve note, she'll be totally confused. Not because she's a blonde, but just because she's never heard of a Federal Reserve note before. I didn't mean to offend the blondes out there. Men come in all colors too. I grew up with blonde hair until I got into college, and it began to get dark. But thank God it's not too gray yet. But this illustrates the ignorance that's out there. They do not know what the thing is called that we call money. And a show on CNN a while back talked about economic reforms that had to occur in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and whether the U.S. should participate in reforms by providing funds. And when you talk about reform, it usually refers to the banking systems, the money system, the economic systems. And this expert from the government, if they represent the government, they are experts, you know that. And he said that absolutely not. We would no way provide for funds if the nations in question did not submit to a central bank to monitor